Welcome back to Men and the City, and hello to you. Hope you're doing well wherever you may be. Coming to you today from Battery Park in New York City, Lower Manhattan to be more specific. Battery Park, I'll share some images in the video, is a rather historic place. Lots of very interesting things happened, dating all the way back to the inception of the Republic and before. The Dutch came here originally as part of the Dutch East India Company. After that, obviously the English and successive wars and turnover, eventually it became part of the United States. Well, in a sense, it is upon such a subject that I want to talk to you today. This video is going to be fairly involved, so if you're listening to this, grab a cup of coffee or some tea, maybe something to eat, sit down, because this one's going to be a long one. Today's video is going to be about an Arabic concept called Asabiyyah, but I'm going to call this video the Rise of Masco-Nationalism. Now, the inspiration for this video, or the thought process behind it, was actually triggered by a comment left from a previous video that I made about acceleration and escalation of events around the world. And I thought the comment was rather provocative and insightful, because he said, or he posed the question, he said, I wonder if this neo-masculine movement upon which you speak is actually going to be a neo-Islamic movement. And this video is going to talk about that, because I think the answer to that question is both yes and no. And my response to his comment was effectively that neo-masculinity is a global phenomenon unfolding around the world, but it's going to manifest itself in very different forms. One of them may be a kind of neo-Islamism, if you will. To set the stage for today's discussion, I want to reference a very brilliant Islamic scholar, an Arab by the name of Ibn Khaldûn. Now, Ibn Khaldûn was ahead of his time. He's not as well known in the West, although that has changed over the last few decades. But he was a sociologist, he was a historian, you might say he was an anthropologist. He wrote about religion, he wrote about culture, he wrote about language. He wrote a very famous book called the Kitab al-Ibar. And at the beginning of that book was this concept of Asabiyyah. And Asabiyyah is a word that doesn't translate all that well into English. And for those of you who speak Arabic, feel free to offer your thoughts in the comments, because it is a very relevant concept, in my opinion, relative to how the world is changing. And Ibn Khaldûn, like a lot of famous historians like Arnold Toynbee as an example, or Oswald Spengler, saw history, saw civilizations rise and fall in cycles. Again, this taps into the fall of the age of prosperity and the rise of the age of scarcity. And I'll come back to the cyclicality of this at the end of the video. But part of what spurred the beginning of a civilization was this transition away from being sparsely populated or dispersely populated nomadic tribesmen, what we might call today the Bedouin of the desert, into a more cohesive group, into a more homogeneous society that calcifies around common identity or language, in some cases blood, although it wasn't limited to common blood or ethnicity necessarily. But what facilitated their emergence as a civilization was this conquering spirit that Khaldûn referred to as Asabiyyah. And Asabiyyah, for all intents and purposes, for those of us who are Western, which is most of my audience, is a kind of nationalism. It's a kind of cohesion or esprit de corps. It's a kind of fervor that binds people together. Now, why start with this concept? Back in 2019, I was in Hong Kong during the protests that were massive. So for those of you that weren't all that engaged on that topic at the time, there were mass protests in Hong Kong in part because the local government, the local Hong Kong government, had more or less succumbed or surrendered to the authority of Beijing. And this was crystallized in a bill that granted extradition power to Beijing. In other words, if you committed a crime that the Chinese Communist Party did not like, you spoke out against the government or something like that, whatever, that Beijing had the right to extradite you from Hong Kong. Now, for decades, there had been a split. There had been one China, but there had been effectively two nations in Hong Kong and mainland China. And so this extradition act passed by this Hong Kong government represented the termination of that, and that provoked a number of protests. And in the West, this was portrayed as a democratic movement, a movement of solidarity to break away or resist Beijing. And that's not really what was happening at all. In fact, and I can tell you because I was there, what was really happening is that Hong Kong was being re-assimilated into China, just like Macau before it, and I would argue just as Taiwan will be as well. What is also noteworthy is that the Hong Kong population, or the Hongkies, as they're called, was actually split. In other words, they weren't all opposed to Beijing. That was a Western myth propagated in the mainstream press. And actually, there were more than a few Western journalists on the ground in Hong Kong who were promulgating messages to the Chinese saying that there would be Western intervention. And there's some evidence that there was covert interaction between maybe Western intelligence services and protesters in Hong Kong. Who knows? Maybe. In any case, the population in Hong Kong was split about 50%, maybe more, sided with Beijing. Certainly not a majority went all in with China, but a majority did not side with democracy either. And when I was there, it was very clear to me, because I interacted with a lot of mainland Chinese, that a new culture, a new sentiment had emerged among the Chinese, a sort of nationalism. And nationalism is really a Western idea, so let's leave it there for a moment. What was really happening in China, and I think is continuing to happen, is that the Chinese collectively were gaining a renewed sense of self-confidence as a people. And part of this was because life was very difficult for them under Mao. Those were some very terrible decades. The Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, so forth and so on, killed tens of millions of Chinese, mostly through starvation and collectivized farming. But these were very harrowing times. And that changed around the time that Deng Xiaoping became the leader of China in the 1980s. But the Chinese, by the time I'd gotten there, had actually begun to modernize. They'd begun to reawaken. There was a new fervor, a new sentiment, a new pride. And so the population in China, contrary to what you hear in the West, was actually very on board with this renewed sense of Chinese nationalism that was centered in Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist efforts to promote prosperity and a reintegration of the country, which included Hong Kong, and as we speak, it includes Taiwan. Fast forward to 2022, so a few years later, during the lead up to the Russian incursion into Ukraine. A very similar kind of effect was happening in Russia based on what I can gather, and that is that Russia, like China, had gone through a very difficult and tumultuous time under the Soviets. And the emergence of Vladimir Putin was a divergence away from that. In the West, this is not understood at all. as some of you watching may know. Putin is repeatedly disparaged as a tyrant and authoritarian, much as Xi Jinping is. But these are Western pronouncements or perceptions of what's really going on. The Russian incursion into Ukraine was a line being drawn in blood to push back on the West or globalization or the spread, you might say, of vulture capitalism around the world. And that was largely supported by the Russian population. Again, a broader sense of renewal, a new period, a new age rising, and a departure, thank God, from a very brutal Soviet period. Fast forward to October of this year, so about a year and a half later, we had a very harrowing event, a tragic event that occurred with a Hamas attack, a very well organized and well planned attack that penetrated Israeli borders and killed about 1,000 Israelis and has provoked a rather aggressive and militarized response on the part of Israel and by extension the United States, unfortunately. What is feeding into all of these things is a kind of Masco-Nationalism. And I want to focus specifically on the rise of strong men and how Asabiyyah, this concept of solidarity or nationalism or esprit de corps, a new sense of cohesion emerging in the collective zeitgeist of various peoples around the world, is manifest in these new strong men. And I want to focus on 4 men in particular. I've mentioned 2 of them already. One is Xi Jinping. And I think it's noteworthy that Xi Jinping came to power in 2014. Now, Putin comes along a bit before then, but 3 of the 4 men on my list came to power about 10 years ago. And remember, if you recall a video I made a couple weeks ago, I said there's a rule of 10. It takes about 10 years to build anything. Well, the realization of this Asabiyyah, this new sense of societal self-confidence and nationalism that I think is brewing around the world in various forms, has been underway for some time. We're just now beginning to feel the effects. Well, Xi Jinping represents the signification, the renewal, you might say, of dynastic power in China through a strong man named Xi Jinping. We think of things in a very binary sense in the West. Either it's democracy or it's authoritarianism. This is a false interpretation of the world. It's a completely ignorant interpretation of the world, I should say. As most of you who are watching and are informed know, especially those of you that have traveled around the world or are from other parts of the world beyond the West. Putin, in a similar fashion, represents the czarification of Russia once again, or the re-czarification. In other words, the rise of Orthodox Christian Russian nationalism embedded in a strongman we know of as Vladimir Putin. Both of these forces, incidentally, are pushing back on the West, or at least the West in its modern form, which, as we know, is a corruption of the West. We'll come back to that in a minute. The next man on my list is Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Some people call him RTE, and Erdogan came to power more or less about 10 years ago as well. Well, what does he represent? He represents the re-Ottomanization of Turkey, and by extension of the Middle East. Again, another strongman who, to some degree, is the inversion of what modern Turkey began as under a man named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. So some of you watching may not be as familiar with Ataturk, but Ataturk, who was not a Turk, incidentally, made some very strident efforts to reform or westernize, you might say, or secularize Turkey. And he did so by using brute force. He concentrated the vessel of change in the military. And to a large extent, it was very successful, at least in its inception. Well, Erdogan, who's coming along almost 100 years later, is reversing a lot of that. He is, in a sense, reverting Turkey back to what it once was. Asabiyyah, tapping into that same sense. In other words, the driving force of Turkey, and you might say of the Middle East today, is not the secularization project set in motion by Kemal Ataturk some 100 years ago. It's what's happening now. It's this reconnection or this resurgence of Masco-Nationalism manifesting itself as Asabiyyah, or this re-Islamization of an entire region. The fourth person on my list is Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi is a similar kind of strongman. Some refer to him as a Hindu nationalist. He represents the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. And Modi is effectively trying to reinstitute or resuscitate the Raj. And remember, Raj is a Sanskrit word that means the rule. In each of these cases, whether it's India or it's Turkey or it's Russia or China, these are countries that are effectively reinventing themselves after about a century or more of either being directly or indirectly dominated by the West or internally subverted, internally divided, fragmented, or in decline. Well, we're at the end of that period, and it's being fueled by this Asabiyyah, this Masco-Nationalism embedded in strong men around the world. For us as Westerners to understand this a little bit better, I'd like to reference a guy named Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin was a philosopher, thinker, but he described nationalism as an inflammation of consciousness. What has happened over the last several years, whether it's in Hong Kong, as I mentioned during those protests, and the assimilation, the gradual reconquista, you might say, of what was broader China, or this Russia-Ukraine war, this dividing line between Orthodox Russia and the West, or India's break from the West during this conflict with Russia. Remember that the foreign minister of India, and I'll link to this information below, basically said, we're going to continue to buy oil from Putin and Russia because it's in our interest to do so, and we could care less what the West thinks. Very substantial, direct, and poignant point. Or it's Erdogan and the rise of Islamization, or the re-Islamization of Turkey. This last event, I think, is the most important of them all, this Hamas attack, because it looks to me as though Israel and potentially the West is going to be drawn into a conflict with this rising tide of Asabiyyah, this Masco-Nationalism rising around the world. At the same time that this is happening, however, there is an inflammation of consciousness happening in the West too. There's this neo-masculine movement, as I've called it, that is beginning to build. It's pushing back on globalism. It's pushing back on globalization or vulture capitalism. You know, this perversion of the West that has taken root over the last 50 to 100 years. So what comes next? What does all of this mean? Where are we headed? Well, in the early 90s, there were two books that were written that more or less divined the future of global politics. One was a very famous book called The End of History. It was written by a guy named Francis Fukuyama. And the end of history essentially declared that democracy had won, or that our perception of the liberal order had defeated its alternatives or its opponents, namely Soviet communism, but there were other forms of it. Some people thought Islam would be an opponent. That's part of what fueled the war on terrorism, if you recall. But in any case, Fukuyama declared victory and said that the West and its model was unassailable, undefeated, and would prevail in the years and decades ahead. There was another book around the same time written by a man named Samuel Huntington called Clash of Civilizations. Clash of Civilizations argued quite the opposite. In fact, it argued that liberalism would confront, or Western culture would confront, other civilizations like Islamic civilization, potentially Sino-civilization, Chinese civilization, and that there would be a renewal, a new spiritual reawakening, if you will, of Islam or of alternative civilizational constructs that would oppose Western liberalism. And in fact, I think in many respects that has happened. But I would make a slight addendum. I don't think it's clash of civilizations. I think it's clash within civilizations. Now, nobody knows the future, and it's very possible that a war of some magnitude does emerge because of the incompetence of Western leaders today, who find themselves beholden to a very small group of globalists that may embroil us in this war. That is possible. But I think more likely is that you're going to see the rise of these resurgent Masco-nationalist forces, this Asabiyyah, in various forms around the world as part of this cycle. And my hope is, and I think my analysis agree, that these forces inside these civilizations will manifest themselves in strong men that will consolidate or reconsolidate civilizations of old. And I suspect that that will happen in the West as well. Although at this stage it looks very bleak, it looks unlikely, but my sense is that it's very likely indeed because of the demolition of the global financial economic system. That will, to some degree, liberate us from the vulture capitalism and the globalism and all the rest. But in any case, across the board, this Masco-nationalism is rising. And it will embed itself in strong men. And strong men will reorganize the global community so that it is more stable, more sustainable. And hopefully, that process will not be as bloody as we all think. But it certainly could be. The rise of Masco-nationalism is upon us. And Asabiyyah, this sense of solidarity, of group cohesion, is fueling it. And it's happening all over the world. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.